Hi, we wanted to welcome you to our virtual presentation. I'm here with Chris Jansen. I'm Christy Sweeney, both of us from the University of North Florida. And today we're actually going to be talking about athlete activism. As most of us are aware, there was a time when people believed that social activism of athletes was a fad, and it is apparent after 2020 and as we enter into 2021 that it really has become commonplace, and that athletes as activists is really here to stay, in large part because of their focus on American politics and American culture. So we hope you enjoy our presentation. So a couple of things which is really interesting. This research actually started in 2017 and really kind of foreshadowed the catapulting, I would say, of athlete activism of 2020. And we have a short video clip that does a great job of really summarizing what took place in the last year.
Planning their return, and while many eventually did, and champions were once again crowned, this year many won't remember what team won and what team lost. They'll remember athletes finding their voices, using them in an unparalleled way, no longer just shutting up and playing. The police killing of George Floyd, the tipping point. No sports to distract or turn away to. Protests across North America rising up night after night. United athletes rising up too by taking a knee and stepping away from the game. A pandemic shutting down sports, and when they returned, athletes shutting down the game.
The consensus is to not play in tonight's slate of games, and to kneel, lock arms, and raise fists during the national anthem.
Because for the first time in the quiet of all this chaos, sporting heroes understanding their platform, using its full weight like never before.
In life, you find things that hold value, and things to fight for. And we found something worth fighting for, and I usually choose that as a symbol to me to keep fighting all around the world.
Women's leagues, the WNBA and NWSL leading the way.
It is striking with the 7 bullet holes. Jacob Blake shot 7 times in the back.
I go to war with these guys, and I hate their guts on the ice, but I couldn't be more proud of these guys.
But even in our mourning, sports found a way to make us smile.
Oh, this one back here by Davies. Still, and it's 5.
So we thought that would be a good way to frame what really provoked us to look back at this research that was conducted in 2017, when first kicked off by Colin Kaepernick, sitting down and then later kneeling during the performance of the national anthem in order to draw attention to the struggle for Black lives, especially in terms of racial inequities and how they play out in the criminal justice system. So our purpose then, as it's going to be now, as we follow up with this study down the road, is to understand the perspectives held toward athletes who were protesting during the national anthem. So that question, what are the collective attitudes that are held? We were really interested in digging into human subjectivity. And so one of the best methodologies to do that is a methodology called Q methodology. It was developed by William Stevenson, who was a psychologist and a physicist. And he was perplexed with finding different kinds of ways to more holistically capture human subjectivity in ways that surveys have some severe limitations, and then also qualitative research does. So it mixes both. It uses qualitative techniques and then also quantitative statistical methods, specifically factor analysis, to determine perspectives that are shared within a population. So with that being said, at the time, we generated statements. So what happens with this methodology is that people represent their view by sorting items in ways that represent their perspective. So to build these sortable items, we ended up with 37. We extracted statements from two different sources. We extracted 87 distinct statements from news articles and online discussion threads. There was a lot of if you recall, there was a lot of kind of hot perspectives being shared on social media at the time. We also asked 26 different participants to respond simply to that open-ended prompt. You know, what are your attitudes? What are the variety of attitudes you share or have around professional athletes protesting during the national anthem? That produced 130. And so from those 217 statements, through a process of just eliminating reproductions, combining similar items, we reduced that down to a representative sample of those 217 items into a 37 item Q sample. Here are a couple examples. Statement 8, protesting the national anthem, alleging it's racist against African Americans and people of color is really a passive aggressive anti-white movement. Statement 16, the protests are spreading to colleges, high schools, and beyond. They're beginning to feel like a movement. Yeah, it's interesting because those suppositions, especially 16, turned out to be pretty prescient. It later did happen in fuller bloom, as did the white animosity, that we've seen as recently as the attack on our Capitol by white supremacists. So we had a variety of sorters. We had a data set ultimately of 29 different sorters, a pretty solid mix, both by gender and racial ethnic identity. For a Q sample, by the way, factors stabilize relatively quickly. So 29 sorters is a pretty strong population or sample of sorters. We also asked for them to self-identify their political leanings and also if they were involved in military service. And from that process, then we factor analyzed. First, we correlated those 29 sorts, and then we factor analyzed the correlations. It produced 3 different perspectives, which we then named. So the first perspective is factor A, which we named patriotic, enlightening, demonstrating agency and advocacy. This was a factor that was comprised of people of color, 8 African American people, participants, 2 Latino, and then 3 white people. Their political perspectives range from very liberal to some that consider themselves centrist. This perspective was permeated by the ideas that the prominent statements where I believe protesters have brought some very good and needed discussions across this country about racial injustices. There's much energy, behind the rage toward these protests, while there is such apathy toward the mistreatment of citizens who are marginalized. So this was a group on the whole that understood and had some sympathy and understanding for the racial injustices that the athletes were really saying at the time they were protesting for. They were not confused about the purpose that was, I think many people looking back now realize was pretty explicitly stated by Colin Kaepernick and other athletes. Likewise, they felt like this was a great way for athletes to be able to use their positionality, that they were politically astute. Some were just basically confused about why the outrage.
Can I interject really quick? I think one of the things that's really interesting is looking back and thinking that if in 2017 the athletes were politically astute and had the ability or recognized that they had platforms to speak on. And what we saw in 2020 was even more politicized. Like as you saw in the video, LeBron James with his Make America Great play hat on. And I think what's really interesting is that they realized in 2020 that collectively together, their platform's even so much larger. So I think one of the reasons for doing a future study that Chris and I have talked about is just this. First of all, we're in a very even more hyper politicized environment. So where the responses that people will have now in 2021 be, you would think would be different than what was seen here.
Yeah. Yeah, those are good points. Conversely, this perspective rejected ideas that this is a misdirected effort to protest, that these athletes are unappreciative of being American and the wealth that this country that they believed had afforded them. They rejected the idea that it was disgraceful and that it was ignorant, and all the perspectives, as we'll talk later, were in agreement actually about the fact that athletes weren't doing this to build their brand. Even the ones we'll see in the next perspective who are very much opposed to these protests did not believe that it was a cynical self-ploy to increase their own personal standing and visibility. These were some descriptive comments that the sorters left. And so sorters who loaded on this factor said these things after their sorts. I don't believe this is disrespectful at all. I believe, in fact, this celebrates and acknowledges the rights of people. This is a serious problem. So they're acknowledging, that these athletes are bringing light to what is a substantial issue. Again, foreshadowing the movement for Black Lives in its more robust form this past year. And that also models agency. It was courageous, they viewed it as, that this was like, people are taking risks. They're putting their own standing on the line to do what's right. In sharp contrast, factor B was comprised of only white people, 8 white men, 2 white women. It was very conservative in the political outlook. One person identified as a centrist. This perspective, as you can see, were permeated by very different things. Legitimacy of the cause aside, protests during the anthem are the wrong approach at the wrong time and the wrong occasion. Disrespects the military. So not quite listening to the message that was explicitly stated and instead associating it with a diss on the military, and disrespectful to the country. They also saw it as being futile. Nothing's going to change. And all these athletes are, but also did say that they did recognize that the athletes were politically astute in using their voice, even though they disagreed with the message. Again, they rejected the idea that this was about branding. They also rejected, as you could imagine, the idea that the national anthem was written when old white racists ruled the land, and if you look closely, it does not reflect that racism. Honestly, I just love how a small thing can enrage so many people. So there was a perspective embedded in here. These were the things that they just, they thought that there was very much reason to be enraged. They felt like these athletes were on the whole disrespecting the values that they were accompanying with patriotism. You can see that reflected in those descriptive comments. These athletes are the new foot soldiers to the Black Lives Matter war on law enforcement. Echoes of what we heard throughout this far right movement over the last year, and even leading up to the events when those same forces stormed the Capitol. The last factor was a little bit moderate, a little bit in the middle. They felt on the whole that these protests were overblown, misguided, unprofessional, but at the end of the day, they supported their rights to protest. So I think that that's permeated, or really what sticks out to me here is they did find they were a little bit amused by the outrage on both sides. They said they didn't fully understand the oppression that the protests were attempting to address, but they supported the actions of the protesters nonetheless. I would imagine, like Christy had mentioned, if we did this now and some of these same people sorted, I wonder how many of these people would have been pulled maybe more in either one of the directions, that now they've had even more time to be educated by activists, athletes and others.
Well, and one of the other too, I think we saw that. We've seen, Roger Goodell came out apologizing to Colin Kaepernick, saying that he misunderstood. And I think that's one of the things Chris and I have talked about, which I think we still see at times. when people are politically on one side of the argument, there's a lot of misinformation about what the facts are. So like Chris, you're saying that it wasn't, it was 2 weeks before the media picked it up that in 2016 when Kaepernick, I believe, sat on the sideline during the national anthem.
Mhm.
So you think like, and that's really, we think 4 years later to have in August of 2020, the culmination of Colin Kaepernick's really stance it's really somewhat profound, actually, as to how it has played out. To understand that athletes do have a voice, but that their voice together is so much louder. So that idea of keep politics out of sports, which was really at this also introduced or reinforced by the president at the time, it really has been kind of fascinating to see all of it play out, especially.
Yeah, you can see how some of these, like there are hints of things that you still hear now, but this was almost a critique without directly critiquing the message and the politics behind it. Like, people have the right to protest, but not at work. That's they draw the line there. That's unprofessional. Or critiquing even the other side, that people stand for the national anthem, but maybe they don't even know why they're standing. So this is almost like this middle cynical ground, looking both cynically at factor A perspectives and actually B too. So some of the comments are about, this is overblown, it's misguided, it's unprofessional, but, and this was a white respondent. As a white person, I cannot claim to fully understand the oppression that these athletes and persons of color have experienced, yet I support them, which is kind of an interesting, a take. This methodology also produces items that are shared across perspectives. Sometimes when they're in the middle, like the bottom two, it's often because people aren't really so sure where it fits. They don't react too strongly to it. But I found it interesting, especially because I know that Christy's done a lot of work around branding, that even those who opposed the protests and the ones who supported it, not any of them thought that this was about athletes really trying to mete out their own self-interest, which I found pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I think, it's true. And I think Colin Kaepernick, the Nike ad they ran, essentially, if you believe in something, you're willing to give up anything. And to think Colin Kaepernick believed in this, he certainly didn't do it to increase the value of his brand, because he essentially, probably in the short term, lost in terms of doing it. I think you saw in 2020, I think it did become easier. So I will say that I think when you think of 2017, if you're some of the few, I would say, because now there's the many and the masses, I'm sure some of them knew that there would be implications, potentially negative implications. And you saw a few athletes who came out and made statements, individual statements, either for or against choices that were made in 2020. But certainly, they weren't doing it for brand; they were doing it for cause. I think even solidifies more the future of what athlete activism looks like.
So with our last minute, really, we just wanted to talk about a few implications then and now. That one thing that is clear and probably hasn't changed, that there's a very bifurcated, polarized view of what a patriot does and is. Is a patriot somebody who stands up and fights for civil liberties, and in the process necessarily critiques our institutions? Or is a patriot somebody who, without questioning, subscribes to almost like what people would also refer to as jingoism? There was great racial stratification in the perspectives. The factor B perspective, again, was comprised only of white people. It anticipated the continued kind of social boogeyman of the Black Lives movement. Like, you could see already that being in the subconscious or conscious minds of people who are reacting strongly against it. But on the other hand, too, we saw over 2020 the blooming of the movement for a way that perhaps then nobody could have anticipated. And I'll leave the politics of sports piece to my colleague Christy.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I've said it, I think maybe I said it in the beginning, but sports and politics, they're really mixed, I think, at least in our culture in America forever. I think you're no longer going to see athletes, especially professional athletes, shy away from making social, political, or cultural comments and or stances one way. And I think we talk a lot about the significance of sport in our culture and sports ability to kind of move us forward or to work on our societal ills. And so it's taboo. And when Colin Kaepernick first started kneeling, that was the biggest argument, was keep politics out of sports. I turned the game on Sunday to escape everything else. And I do think this era of politics that we've gone through has really infused politics almost into everything.
Yeah.
But,
so thank you. We'll be on hand to respond to questions, and we appreciate your attention.
Thanks. Hopefully we'll see you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This is the Q&A for the presentation, Athlete Activism, Understanding Attitudes Held Towards Professional Athletes, by Chris Jansen at the University of North Florida and Christy Sweeney at UNF as well. A lot of the sessions this afternoon have started to kind of get smaller and smaller. So rather than me sit here and orchestrate questions and answers, we can kind of just have a conversation and kind of hop in and talk that way as y'all see fit. So I'll turn it over to Christy and Chris, and y'all can, if you want to start it off or introduce yourselves in another way, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Go ahead, Christy.
Oh, thanks for joining us. I was just on another one. I was like thinking I was going to be late to this. So hopefully you had a chance to watch our presentation. Chris and I recorded it one night. We only did one take, okay? But we're just really here to answer questions, I think. So if any of you have questions, I mean, it's kind of timely, I think, after yet another round of conversations about the national anthem with Mark Cuban deciding not to play it. I think it's interesting. I've read some articles, and Mark Cuban, his idea of really encouraging courageous conversations, and his thought was, how long will it take for someone to notice? Who will notice? And, it's interesting that it took, it was like the 12th game before. But so I think it's just timely that we're talking about it again, but I'll let Chris go and tell them.
Hi, Jen. Hi, Emily. So I'm not a sport management faculty member. I focus on some other things in education, but I think that's where this started. The idea to re-explore, this study that really was designed and 4 years ago. So a little over 4 years ago, when I guess just a couple months before the 2016 election. And the more Christy and I have talked about this phenomenon, this issue over the years, the events over the past year certainly have brought this back, kind of top of mind, because you could see echoes, or precursors in terms of what we've experienced as a country this past year, not only in terms of the movement for Black Lives, but actually the Capitol insurrection. So there was a heavy kind of correlation of political affiliation leading among the participants in this study and how they grouped. So we are planning on seeing how attitudes may have shifted now. That's where this is headed. But that's really the context, is kind of looking back at these data that were almost in some ways like a canary in the mine shaft. So I thought it was pretty prescient to see, especially the descriptive comments that people left, in addition to expressing their opinions through the actual sorting process. Those were very striking. Different perspectives that can have wildly different ideas of what patriotism is. So as we're watching the impeachment hearings, I mean, that's still resonant today. And so the other thing I think that your context in sport is it makes it so powerful is that arguably it's been the setting of sport where I would argue that some of the most nuanced and courageous conversations about race have taken place over the past year, and others in other fields, especially those who are really involved in public education. It's almost painful to say that, because I wish we could stake that claim, but it really has been sport stepping up in big ways. So that's my context for it.
And I think Chris and I had some conversations, I think, as even over the last year, we've seen, I think, and I don't want to lump together, but we've seen growing divide. I've seen a growing divide in terms of the stance on Kaepernick in a written context from students. And it has, I mean, what's really interesting about the study is there is such a political undertone to the Kaepernick conversation. So I spent time in the fall during a sport finance class talking to students about diversity. Some of whom I'm sure students weren't overly receptive. A lot were, but there is definitely a political undertone, and no longer are sports and politics separate. They're not. That idea of I want to go to a football game to escape every day or the news cycle is not necessarily, I don't think, the future, because I do think athlete activism is here to stay. I think leagues will be mindful. I'm not sure at some point in time, in terms of their social media platforms, if at some point in time they'll try and do some collective bargaining around it. But I do think it has become a very important piece for our students to understand. I'll just give you one example. I had a conversation with a student, ended up, this conversation was with him and his mother, because by the time I couldn't get him on Zoom and then I got on the phone, he's like, would it be okay if my mom gets on the phone? And I was like, and it was about an assignment, and the assignment, we have an adjunct faculty member who taught diversity, and she assigned them. Essentially, it was about the two political parties and what are their stances on all these things. And it was pretty cut and dry, but it was for them to understand that where that plays into diversity. And the student nor the mother, I don't think, were too excited over the assignment. This has nothing to do with sport. And I'm like, well, take, for example, if you work for the Green Bay Packers, that are an extremely conservative part of Wisconsin, and you have athletes who want to protest the national anthem or highly outspoken about Black Lives Matter. At some point in time, you have to figure out how you navigate, right? Sport managers of the future have to navigate their diverse fan bases, and the diversity of their fan bases, from race and ethnicity and gender to political viewpoints. So I do think for a long time, right, you keep politics out of your classroom, but politics it is a part of sport post 2020.
That's an interesting story of the student's mother being involved in the conversation with I teach a collegiate athletics class, and I teach another class for first semester college athletes at South Carolina, the student athlete experience. And we talk about activism in both. And I found that the students are generally, when I prompt them, they haven't formulated an opinion necessarily. They are, for the most part, reciting, in my opinion, what they've heard their parents, their grandparents, more elderly people in their life, who's older people in their life. And so when I ask them to formulate their opinion, a lot of times, and I am not giving them, prompting them to go a certain way, right? And just presenting information to them, they end up saying, yeah, it doesn't affect if I'm going to watch a game or not, if they take a knee in the national anthem, right? And this younger generation, that isn't on their radar, right? They haven't, you could argue a couple different ways here, but right, they haven't lived through a major war, right? You could argue the war in the Middle East, but in the sense of that my parents did or my grandparents did, there isn't this sort of national pride, like the flag is this sacred item that we can't do anything disrespect. Like there isn't that conversation around it. So I think it's really interesting as students in that story, their mom being involved in the conversation, I think lends exactly to what I see in my classroom with athletes. And when they start to formulate their own opinion, they're like, yeah, I think that they should do that. It's not just they should be able to, they should. If you feel that that's important, you should take an activist approach. And that doesn't affect if I'm going to watch or cheer for a team at all in any way. I think that's really interesting for younger adults.
Yeah. Is your name actually Chris?
Yeah.
Okay. So Chris, I mean, I think that anecdote, those observations that you've made are also a reflection on some things that need to change in the way we school. It's alarming, but arguably public schools are the least democratic public spaces, where there is not a lot of opportunity for debate, discourse, conversation, or students being asked what they feel about what they're learning or experiencing. It's become pretty rote. And so that doesn't surprise me that they would get into a class where you're encouraging that. And that's great. And by the way, I commend that. And they literally, like, I was facilitating a conversation in a intergroup dialogue class this past fall, and there was a lot of contention. There was a student there who was quite openly anti-Semitic and unapologetic about it.
Yeah.
And as we kind of processed as a group the conflict that ensued, and through this like protocol that I have, one of the students said, I realize now I wasn't just uncomfortable because of what was said. I was uncomfortable because a teacher has never asked me what I felt about what I'm learning before.
Sure. Yeah.
At any level. She was a third-year student here at the university, but K-12 as well. So yeah, I think that we unfortunately don't have a lot of experiences, most of us, in having contentious, courageous conversations that involve much at all, but let alone race. Emily, how are you?
Yeah, I'm just sort of following along. This was such a great presentation and so timely for me. I'm teaching an Athletes as Activists class this semester, which is a brand new prep. And it's been an interesting 2 weeks so far. But yeah, I mean, I'm echoing all of the things that you're saying, the kinds of conversations that we had the first week about establishing class norms and prepare to be uncomfortable and prepare to be angry. And how do you navigate that in a space where you don't really know people? And, trying to put myself as facilitator of interaction and not a teacher of knowledge, because I think, like you said, a lot of what's happened has forced conversation that's never happened before. And if I can create a space to make that conversation allowable and okay, that's really all I'm going for, and I think part of it too, in thinking about some of the stuff you've said, just, going from 2017 to now, I mean, there's so much more of history that they don't know that is the same kinds of activism, but because we didn't have social media, or they're not scholars of history, or they've never really been exposed to it. They're like, well, this is all new and different, and they've never done this before, and why are they doing it now? Actually,
Right.
let's tell some stories. So I think, what you guys are talking about is sort of right on point, and I would be very curious to see, what happens moving forward. And even, using secondary stuff and going backwards to Ali, and like, have we
Oh, yeah.
really unpacked what we can get from newspaper and what we can get from those things? And do we still have these clear polarizing ideas, and do the lines in which, I mean, you guys talked about the different categories and demographics of people that were, factor A, B, and C. Are those same categories sort of still indicative of what we're seeing now? So I just thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah. Where do you teach, Emily?
St. John Fisher College. It's a small D3 school in Rochester, New York.
Okay. Yeah. I have a friend who just moved. Actually, we have a friend from the university who just moved back to, is it University of Rochester?
U of R? Yeah.
Yeah.
My sister-in-law works there. Do you know Sarah Vench?
Yes, I do.
That's my sister-in-law.
Too funny. All right.
So that's is the class you're teaching, is it face-to-face? Is it remote? Is it?
It is face-to-face. I have a few remote students, but it is face-to-face.
Have you taught it before?
No, this is a brand new class. I proposed it, it got accepted, and here we are.
So yeah, because
we come and do our presentation in your class for you.
Yeah. Have you read the literature on teacher evaluations when there's content around race and contention?
I didn't have to read it, I've lived it, but I have tenure, so now we're good.
Yeah, good. Okay.
So so one thing I would say, and this is really why Chris and I started having the conversation again. So our primary faculty member who teaches diversity, I am in his classes. I am kind of like shadow his classes, and in part because I get to see some of the things they do. But the conversations, I'll use Kaepernick specifically, has just become so much more polarized. And so I would encourage you, and maybe Chris, you're the same, is while you engage your students face to face, to give them some controversial topics potentially that they can write about, and see what they put down on paper, and see if what they're putting down on paper is different than what they're willing to say in a classroom. I know I always tell people this, and this is probably for you, Chris, when I was in graduate school, I had a class, it was called Transformational Learning, and we had to write our autobiography and about like what transformed our learning and all these things. And I just, I remember having this classmate, and she was crying, she's having the hardest time. She's like, I can't do this. Because, when you write things down, it's really hard to write. You don't write lies down on paper, you shouldn't. But just, things that she had growing up, that she saw the world completely differently. So I would encourage that, because, sometimes in a classroom, you have a student who's really has something to say, but isn't going to say it. Mm-hmm. They might write it. And that's really where I went to touch base, and Chris and I started talking again, because I do think, they'll be more polarized today. And I do think that a big part of that is, whether we want to admit it or not, is the political landscape in which we live. And when I was reading students write things it was like they were on Twitter, and they were 140 character tweets after the other.
I put a book in a link to a book in the chat box. It was written by a friend of mine who's at University of Georgia, it's been really helpful for me to help think through and facilitate conversations that are contentious and involve race. And so essentially he writes about this concept of difficult knowledge. What happens when we learn something that we don't really want to know? Because it involves human suffering, oppression, things that, make us uncomfortable. It kind of emerged, I think, initially out of Holocaust studies. But, some really fascinating, work and thinking that ultimately, when that kind of knowledge, when we're confronted with it even on some level resonates, maybe even with trauma that we've experienced individually, or of course, racial trauma that other groups of people that don't look like me have experienced. So we're actually working really hard to develop ways to to prevent people from distancing intellectually in these conversations, that we think that like being able to stay and explore the affective emotional landscape of these conversations is really useful and helpful. So we're writing a manuscript about that now, but I've found that to be really helpful, because I don't know. I've gained really. I've become really kind of frustrated, and as I think Jen knows this too, and Christy, with our default reactions as academics, and sometimes we, pass this on to our students. When we want them to learn something and to have these tough conversations, we assign books or readings, and I think that there's some evidence to suggest that we can plow people with all kinds of new information, and it might be accurate and it might be compelling. It doesn't change minds. It's an interesting thing about us as human beings. Facts don't change our minds, and so that's a dilemma for sport management educators and like educators of all stripes. I think we have to rethink, and so I think that work, I think, combined with Singleton and Litton's Courageous Conversations About Race, where you can start, it helps people kind of think through, like, how do I engage in these conversations? Am I just intellectualizing it? Am I just kind of thinking about, action? Am I just thinking of, so I think that work's really helpful.
Yeah, and I've spent a lot of time sort of learning about sustained dialogues, and we have a pretty solid sustained dialogues group on campus. And so I'm definitely drawing on that training, as well as just sort of my experience that, like you said, we can assign everything that we want and they may never get there. And so I really try to design things that will allow them to arrive at knowledge rather than me telling them that, because they'll do a much better job of integrating it with what they know if they think they've just discovered it versus I have to learn this because my teacher said. And that goes back to the thing you were talking about earlier with sort of rote memorization. I know what I'm supposed to say here. And so I'm going to say that versus that's what I think.
Yeah, I stumbled upon recently this this thing written in 1963 called Notes on Teaching in Mississippi, and it was developed by SNCC members who knew all of these freedom riders were coming down to Mississippi for Freedom Summer, and they would be working in freedom schools. And at the very beginning, the authors write that your job is to help students start asking questions. That's the goal of education, asking good questions. And yeah, so I think that's something that shouldn't be, but it sounds really radical, like in today's spaces sometimes. So good for you. I'd like to learn from more of your techniques.
Sure. I did have one specific question. You talked about, the Factor C people sort of relaying that there are bigger issues to be worried about. Did you get any sense of what they considered those bigger issues to be?
So this perspective actually, when you asked if we would see some of those similar attitudes toward other kind of issues that are kind of bubbling up today, I think we would. I would characterize. I also did a similar kind of study, actually the same kind of design, that have around people's attitudes toward the presence of the Confederate flag at NASCAR events, which is now kind of a moot point, right? But anyway, there was a third view that was similar to this, like a detached, almost sociological view. That was like, what? I don't agree with what the Confederate flag seems to represent to people. I understand it's offensive to others. However, when I go to a NASCAR event, I want the whole experience. I want Leonard Skinner playing in the background. I want people funneling beers, and I want to, and that's ambiance. So yeah, they weren't asked to talk about what the other issues were. I think that it was kind of the idea of it being overblown, like I can't, like I'm somehow above the fray. And the people who are feeling very convicted and stratified on either side are kind of fools. and so it was a real pragmatic, like, okay, we understand that because one nuance of that view too was that there are important issues behind these protests. So there wasn't like a real insistence on denying that. The perspective though was like, this is the wrong approach because it's so polarizing. I think there's some naivete in this view though, because I think what people have, kind of made some strong cases around over the past, once the BLM march protest started around the country was like, listen, now you have a problem with this. You also had a problem with peaceful kneeling. Like where is that space where anti-racist activism is permissible? So yeah, I'm not sure that they were thinking that there were other big ideas. I don't think that though they were referring to sport. I think those were like, there's larger sociological issues. But I think I also think that view's somewhat of a cop out. It's like right in the middle and just saying, oh, and we all know people like that. Like, oh, I don't do politics. And I think to some extent that was that view. But I can share with you the full data set. So the way that this works is when people sort into that forced distribution, which looks like kind of an inverted triangle, all of those different views all the statements have a place. And so the goal of the interpretation is to take it in holistically. When you write a manuscript or present like this, sometimes it's, just kind of convenience. You try to just focus on the statements that were the +4s and the +3s and the -4s and the -3s, because, from a communication theory standpoint, that's what resonated they resonated the most strongly with people's subjectivity. So they are probably more characteristic of the views, but there are some things in the middle that, like, if you're writing a dissertation or a book, you can explore a little bit more some contradictory ideas. There's some thought in terms of methodologists who use that statements that fall in the middle are sometimes there's a psychodynamic interpretation of why an item would be in the zero column. One could be it's just a midpoint between this is a lot like my view and this is not and this is not like my view. But another is that people just didn't have enough. They were unable to like engage in sense making around it, or so it just ends up there. And so sometimes the things we can't make sense of, there's reasons for that. We may have some like serious blocks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Or that we probably know, at least from a student perspective, they don't have, I don't want to say the skills to find out what the facts are, or to find, to reason and to come up with what their ideas should be. I think we see that. I think students, for me, I think talking with students is just trying to encourage them to understand how 2020 and how athlete activism is changing sport organizations, and how as future sport managers they will fit into what an organization is looking for. So every time I have a guest speaker now, I just ask a guest speaker. My standard question for all of them really is, as we've moved through 2020 and seen athlete activism essentially really become what I would say is the change of America. Like, how can you talk about how does your organization address diversity? And then I typically follow it up with beyond what someone looks like, but diversity of thought and these things. And I think that becomes, for, and to be candid, the majority of my students are white males. And I feel like without not addressing those questions and not giving them insight from industry professionals as to how relevant these things are, we're not preparing them to be successful.
As an outsider to your discipline, I think that it's a pretty sexy place to be in, because that's where all these conversations are taking place. But I think on the other, but one of the things I would really be kind of focused on right now is like how persistent are these professional, organizations in this work. I suspect it'll be like our universities. There's a big bubble of action, a lot of book groups, people reading White Fragility, and then it just kind of, drifts away. I see that already, by the way, with the Jacksonville Jaguars. They recently asked a couple of friends of mine who I do a lot of work with to write biographical pieces, essentially, about Black civil rights figures from Jacksonville. And both of them were redacted, edited down to like near nothingness, because there was now who was editing these pieces. It appears one was a youngish, white intern. And then that new director of diversity initiatives that they have. I'm not sure if she touched it, but there's a real like kind of reluctance to even be honest about our community's history. So I wonder what form these different diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are going to look like in a year. Because I think like you had said, Chris, those athletes that you have now are just like, the athletes with the players with the Jaguars are those athletes 4 years from now. Yeah. And so if there are no intervening opportunities for them to learn, they really don't have much of a context besides their lived experiences. So I think that's one of my kind of, I guess, intellectual mentors, wrote frequently that just because we've had experiences as adult learners doesn't mean that we've learned from them. Like there's a process that's involved in learning from your experiences.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
This is great. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Your presentation was great. I really enjoyed it. I will rat you out here, Dr. Sweeney. I did have to edit out like the first 15 seconds because you included saying, well, no one's going to watch this anyway.
Oh, I did. I said, oh, Chris.
Thank you for that. That's a good save. I do remember you saying that. And I was like,
do. I'm trying to think of it. We were trying to get it in by that Friday. I think my daughter was doing something. I don't know. I apologize. Well, I'm glad somebody watched it.
It's just funny. Heather and I were joking about it. It was just
I was like, we got it. We were like, okay, let's do this. And then I watched other people's and they had their PowerPoints. They talked over them. And I was like, well, this is how Chris and I talk, but it's a really interesting conversation. I even told Chris I'd be interested to have students from other parts of the country and to see what the differences would be. Because I mean, where we live in Florida, and Chris and I being Midwesterners originally, transplants to.
Well, those results were from that wasn't just from local people. So
no, but I was saying if you had a group in Jacksonville, Florida, and if you had a group in
there could be
there'd be a difference.
One quick thing, I do want to plug that methodology. So if you're interested at all in perceptions, attitudes, perspectives, I mean I've drunk the Kool-Aid, but I don't think there's anything better. Contact me if you're ever interested in exploring it. And another thing, it's just kind of to the methodology, it's incidental, but in terms of participants, you really ultimately only need around 40. You want to be diverse in how you're selecting people in very purposeful ways, and that selection should be around a broad range of perspectives around that topic that you suspect people have. But I just think it's a different type of approach in surveys, but it's amazing.
Okay. Emily, maybe if you have students, I have a group of students, we could do another study.
Yeah. All right, y'all. Nice meeting you, Emily. Nice meeting you.
Thank you very much. This was great.
Bye. See you later. Thanks, Chris.